It's no secret the world is largely united against Russia and its invasion of Ukraine. But it might surprise you just how the Russian people feel about this invasion. To understand the Russian people and their support for Vladimir Putin, first you have to understand Russian culture and society. Unlike many countries who experienced great evil in the past, Russians never truly came to terms with the abuses of the Soviet Union. In fact, most Russians today still believe that Joseph Stalin was a great man, despite the fact that he imprisoned and killed millions of his own people. In 2016, the dead dictator's approval rating was 54% in a poll conducted by the Moscow Times. In 2019, though, 70% of Russians polled by the independent Levada Center said that Stalin played a favorable role for Russia. Over half of those surveyed even said that they personally viewed Stalin favorably. In May of 2021, a new poll showed that 56% of Russians viewed Stalin as a great leader. South Africa actively strove for racial reconciliation after apartheid. The United States has made civil rights for people of color and other minorities a front and center issue in domestic politics for decades. And Germany has completely denounced its Nazi past and actively works to educate its own children on the horrors of the regime, convinced that such a thing should never happen again. All of these countries and more have acknowledged their past and taken responsibility for it, while taking steps to rehabilitate their societies from the ill effects of said past. It may be an ongoing process in some cases, but the fact that it's happening at all is what's important. Russia has never experienced a collective reconciliation over the brutality of the Soviet regime, and this explains much about the current attitudes on Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Rather than acknowledge all the evils of leaders like Stalin and the great economic and physical harm caused by the Soviet Union, the Russian people have shifted the blame to various groups. A common sentiment in response to the evils of the Soviets is that it was the Bolsheviks. Bafflingly, sometimes Russia's favorite boogeyman, the United States, is to blame. Culpability is constantly deflected from one group to another, and the Russian people aren't completely to blame for this lack of self-accountability. Since 2021, it's been illegal in Russia to deny that the Soviet Union played a decisive role in overcoming fascism in World War II, and it's likewise illegal to equate the war crimes of the Soviet Union, of which there were many, with those committed by Nazi Germany. In Russian schools, history is taught selectively, with many of the Soviet regime's worst abuses either played down or simply not taught. Vladimir Putin even went to great lengths to spin the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany as a diplomatic victory. This pact outlined how Eastern Europe would be carved out by the two world powers, and was so shameful even to Soviet leaders that Mikhail Gorbachev publicly denied it and attempted to rewrite the history behind the pact. This time of historical rewriting by Vladimir Putin's administration helps us to understand why so many Russians support the war in Ukraine today. In 2005, just a few years after Putin's ascension to power, 40% of those polled agreed that Stalin had absolutely decimated the Red Army's leadership prior to World War II with his paranoid purges. This is, of course, a matter of historical fact, and the reason why the Soviets performed so astonishingly poorly during the Winter War against a much smaller Finland. Yet in 2021, only 17% of respondents agreed on the 2005 question. Putin has spent considerable resources to rewrite Russia's understanding of their own history, fully in preparation for his orchestration of a return to a repressive Soviet time, under his firm leadership, of course. Anyone who tries to bring up real history of the Soviet Union is painted as a foreign agent, probably American ones at that, as Putin has turned the US into a national boogeyman who's hiding under every bed and in every closet. His total information control doesn't just extend to the past, though, but also to the present, as media in Russia now is the least free it's been since the strictest days of censorship during the Soviet Union. Journalists who dug too deep into issues the Kremlin did not want exposed, or who wrote articles the Kremlin didn't like, were often discovered dead or missing. For a while, Russia was officially one of the most dangerous places to be a reporter in, and this included places like active war zones in Africa or in the Middle East. After the invasion of Ukraine, Putin's control over the media has only tightened to the point that the average Russian receives a steady diet of pure propaganda. It's now illegal in Russia to refer to the war in Ukraine as anything other than a special military operation, and this law is enforced with steep fines and as many as 15 years in prison. Putin has also passed a law that is in essence the widest sweeping form of censorship that Russia has seen in decades. It's not just illegal to call the war anything other than a special military operation, but it's also illegal to write, post, or say anything meant to hurt Russian morale or spread misinformation. What actually counts as hurting Russian morale or misinformation is, of course, left up to the Kremlin. This gives Putin and his administration incredible power to shape narratives on the war in Ukraine any way they wish. So, how do Russians feel about the war? Given Russia's lack of free speech and government interference in most media, getting accurate data is rather difficult. However, polls conducted by independent and not-so-independent agencies across Russia since the start of the invasion all clearly show overwhelming support for the Russian invasion of Ukraine. One survey showed 65% were in favor of the invasion, while a second showed 71%. Independent polls routinely show figures above 50% approval. How can so many Russians support one of the most horrific conflicts in Europe since World War II? There's a reason why Putin has insisted the war be called a special military operation. It's careful phrasing that's meant to encourage the Russian people that there is no war, just a low-grade military operation. This is no different than a military operation the US might undertake to eliminate a new al-Qaeda cell in a remote corner of Africa. Military operations are routine and, even more importantly, not very wide-sweeping. This is important because despite the two nations having taken wildly different paths since the fall of the Soviet Union, Ukraine is still seen as a brother nation to most Russians. The two share much of the same history and culture, and large amounts of the population speak the same language. The kinship was so close that before the war, Russian troops in the first few weeks of fighting were genuinely shocked that they'd been greeted not as liberators, but as invaders and occupiers. Putin admitting to the Russian people that he was launching a full-scale invasion of Ukraine would be like President Biden announcing that the United States was going to invade Britain. It's an unthinkable proposition for the American people to see themselves at war with a nation they consider to be a true brother nation. And likewise, the Russian people would be shocked to find out the truth about the brutality of Russian actions inside Ukraine. The careful language allows Putin to minimize this outrage, but also allows him to craft the narrative that he needs to continue gaining Russian support. By framing the invasion as a special military operation, Putin has convinced many of the Russian people that this war is actually about securing the safety of the Russian-speaking population of Donbass. But Putin still needed a boogeyman, someone that the Russian people would see as an enemy, and that's why he tapped into history. Putin's public justification for the invasion was that he was cleansing Ukraine of the threat of neo-Nazism. To the world, this is a ridiculous proposition, but to many Russians, it's an issue near and dear to their hearts. Their nation, after all, suffered more than any other at the hands of the Nazis during the Second World War. Thus, by painting this as a conflict against a resurgence of Nazism that threatened fellow Russian speakers, Putin was able to portray this as a heroic and moral war. The fact that these imaginary Nazis are right outside Russia's border only helps those spinning this war as a fight against fascism. Even the fact that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is Jewish has been spun by Russian propagandists who point out that Hitler also had Jewish blood in him. When Russia immediately ran into trouble inside Ukraine, not even the tightest of information control could stop the slow realization that this was no small-scale military operation. Russia was at full-scale war, and its military needed to mobilize as such. The impact of the fighting is so intense that an estimated 20% of all Russian tanks have been destroyed, though this relies only on visual confirmation, and thus the real total is indubitably much higher. 3,342 armored vehicles have been confirmed destroyed, damaged, abandoned, or captured by Ukrainian forces. 115 combat aircraft have also been destroyed, damaged, or captured. Now Putin needed to justify the broadening of the special military operation into full-scale war, and to do this, he once more summoned the favorite Russian boogeyman, the United States of America. The new narrative is that NATO, at the behest of the US, is fighting a proxy war against Russia, while extremists inside of Ukraine pull the strings and force their army and population to fight a war they don't really want to. Casualties are estimated to have reached as high as 20,000 dead, with Ukraine claiming to have confirmed 18,900 as of April 8th, via bodies they have personally collected or intercepted intelligence reports. Yet the Kremlin has cleverly spun this as the work of NATO and the US, thus rallying the Russian people against the much-hated West. But not all Russians support the invasion. In fact, 6,500 people were arrested across 53 cities in Russia during February 24th to March 2nd in anti-war protests, as tens of thousands took to the streets. However, the passage of new censorship laws have taken the wind out of the sails of any Russians who oppose the invasion, as they live in fear of arrest for their anti-war views. Russian police have even been documented searching vehicles and homes for evidence of anti-war sentiments, and Russia is slowly reverting back to a Soviet-era culture of neighbors snitching on neighbors. One thing is clear though, while most Russians support the war in Ukraine, young Russians are the demographic most likely to not support the invasion. And since the start of the war, hundreds of thousands of them have left Russia. Turkey has become a hotbed of anti-war, anti-Putin sentiment among Russians who have fled their own country, as the EU will not allow passage for anyone with a Russian passport. While Russia has disconnected much of global social media from itself, young Russians are more likely to be able to know how to bypass national internet blocks via VPNs, and this exposes them to international news where they can see the truth about the consequences of the brutal war in Ukraine. Translating that to the older population, however, has not been as successful, and many young Russians report they no longer speak with parents or grandparents over their difference of views on the war. Putin may have the support of the majority of the population, but he has very little support amongst the two segments of the population that matter the most: young people and military conscripts. With conscripts making up a quarter of Russian forces, by the end of the war there will be tens of thousands of Russian conscripts returning home with their own version of the war to share. Here, it's important to note that the February Revolution of 1917, which overthrew the Tsar, was largely premeditated by the return of thousands of disillusioned troops from their time on the front. As casualties mount, the reality of the war will begin to sink home with average Russians who have lost husbands, brothers, and fathers in Ukraine. And Putin won't be able to deflect for long the anger of thousands of families grieving loved ones by blaming the West. Now go check out what is wrong with Russia's military, or click this other video instead.